in what became the most famous case in the United Kingdom, in 1995, a man named Diane Blood contracted meningitis. It was so severe that he was going to die. Before he died, his wife, Diane, asked doctors to retrieve his sperm in case he died so she might be able to later create sons that she claimed they both wanted. Stephen did die, and Diane was barred at first from using his sperm to create sons. This is Great Stories in Bioethics, my personal YouTube channel. I'm Gregory Pence. Today is a great story about a lot of people who wanted to create a child after someone had died, usually with sperm, but sometimes with eggs. Sperm and eggs are called gametes, reproductive material. And there's a lot of ethical issues around these cases. So Diane's case was 1995, and there was a law under Britain, their fertilization authority, which said that without explicit consent, a child could not be created this way in England or United Kingdom. So Diane said, well, can I take the sperm to Belgium? Well, there's a fertility clinic there that might allow me to do so. And there was a lot of publicity. There was a big battle. And eventually, although an embryo could not be created in the United Kingdom, they did allow the courts finally for Diane to take the sperm to Belgium, where embryos were created, where, in fact, she had one son and then another. So that whole battle took 2 years. And however, Diane's troubles weren't over, because under British law at the time, and under some American law, states' laws, a child created this way does not have a legal male parent. And as such, there was a question about whether, since this child was actually created in Belgium, whether the sons could be proper British citizens and also inherit as British citizens. And again, a long legal battle occurred. And in 2003, Diane got Parliament to pass a new law that specifically recognized the rights of children created this way. So there's a lot of issues about posthumous creation. One, is it in the best interest of the child? Is there presumed consent, even if there's not written consent by the deceased parent? Should it be an opt-in or opt-out system where if you're presumed, you go ahead and do it unless there's an explicit reason against it? Another issue has to do with exactly what is the status of gametes. Are they just sort of like continuation of life, or is it more like property that can be inherited? And we'll see what the courts say about that. So there was another case in America. There was a West Point cadet named Peter Zhu who died in a skiing accident in 2019. And in this case, his parents sought permission to retrieve sperm after his death. There was no spouse or partner, but the parents wanted his genes to continue. And this was a question that the courts had to wrestle with, whether this was a proper request. So in a case in 2019, very similar in British Columbia and Canada, a man died unexpectedly and his wife petitioned for having sperm removed so she could create a child. And in this case, the court said, unless there was explicit consent from the dead man, no, this could not be done. However, in a case in Iowa in 2007, Daniel Christie, who died in a motorcycle accident, the widow asked for removal of sperm so a child could be created. And in this case, the court interpreted the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which covers disposal of organs, bone marrow, tissue, and parts, that sperm was a part that could be transferred with the consent of the surviving spouse. And so they allowed the sperm to be created. So most of these cases concern sperm, but every once in a while they also concern eggs. 2011, there was an Israeli woman named Chen Ada Ayash. She was 17 and she was killed in a car crash when a car hit her. And her family asked the court to freeze her eggs. And in both these cases, the sperm and eggs, that this needs to be done within 72 hours of death. The court was asked to consider, even though Chen had left no explicit instructions about this, whether this could be allowed. Now, the Israeli courts are pretty famous for making some fairly permissive decisions about this, especially when it comes to the military. So there have been several cases in Israel. One was Robert Carpel, who died during military service. There was another fellow, Shahid Be'eri, was a reserve soldier who in 2004 died during a military exercise when he was 27, and he had wed only 3 months prior to his death when he was childless, and his widow petitioned the court to harvest his sperm so she could create a child. There was another case in Israel named Omri Shahir, who was a 25-year-old career officer who died in a tragic road accident. His parents also appealed to a family court to remove his sperm to create a child. There's been a couple of appeals in these cases, and basically the bottom line in Israel is the spouse or the surviving partner has a right to ask for this, but not the parents or grandparents. So, and this has pretty much become a consensus, even in American, as the guidelines of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine say the same, that the so-called genetic continuity argument, sometimes raised by parents or grandparents, is not enough to overcome the lack of consent of someone who's dead, who's essentially a cadaver. People aren't too worried about the idea that you can't create a child without a living parent. There's lots of people who are raised to only one parent, and the surviving spouse might remarry or also have the help of grandparents. Now, there's a really interesting case in America. It's called Heck versus Superior Court, where a man named William Kane had existing children, and 2 of them, I believe, and he had a girlfriend named Deborah Heck, and he was rich. And he died by suicide, I believe, but he explicitly said that Deborah could use his sperm to create another child. Well, his existing sons opposed this and thought Deborah's desire to have a new child. They didn't want to split their inheritance with somebody else. Basically, in a very landmark decision, the California Superior Court said, sperm is like property. It can be disposed of and transferred legally in a will, and since William Kane's will explicitly allowed Deborah Heck to do this, she was allowed to create a son this way. So this is a really important distinction, and it's had a lot of influence to say that basically sperm and eggs can be seen as hereditable material and property and treated as such in a will. And if there's not a will, then it goes to probate court, and they will decide. And again, usually probate courts give a lot of rights to the existing spouse or partner, and not much to the parents or grandparents. So this has also been cases in India and Vietnam and China where people wanted a line to continue. This has to do a lot of international bioethics. If we step back from this a little bit, the whole question of creating a child from a cadaver who might still have live cells, they should be brain dead, brings up some other interesting questions. Shinya Yamanaka won a Nobel Prize for basically discovering how to take differentiated cells and by tweaking some genes, return them to a pluripotent state where they could later be developed into any other kinds of cells. This obviated the need for embryonic stem cells. It also allowed some breakthroughs in mammalian cloning. And it's possible that one day that because of Yamanaka's work, that the pluripotent cells could be directed to create gametes, to create sperm or eggs, in which case we have a whole new world of creating embryos and gestating babies from the cells of brain-dead people. And to take it one step further, probably even easier than creating live sperm or live eggs from a brain-dead person, you could somehow have frozen cells or take live cells and use somatic cell nuclear transfer to create an embryo, aka cloning. So this may be not too far in the future. And this raises a whole question of whether people who are tragically killed or died unexpectedly, suppose Taylor Swift or LeBron James dies, do they have a right to control what becomes of their genetic legacy, especially posthumously, especially if they didn't explicitly write anything about that. That's where we are today. Many American states are kind of mixed on this. Israel is pretty permissive. Australian regions have different results. France is pretty restrictive. It is going to be a growing area in the future. If you want to read more about this, I would refer you to a paper by Shelley Samana in the Journal of Law and Biosciences, which I use in preparing for this episode. That's a good paper. That's it for today. If you like this, share. See you next Tuesday.